Okay, so this is my lecture portion of my lesson on the Mandan community. So I wanted to start off with just a note about the three affiliated tribes, because today the Mandan are a part of the three affiliated tribes. And the three affiliated tribes consists of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara nations. These three communities became allies after almost being entirely wiped out from the several smallpox epidemics that hit them in waves. The first time that these communities found themselves together, the first location was along the Missouri River at a village called like a fish hook in the 1830s. That was the first place that they all really came together. And this alliance of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara promoted the safety of the tribes during times of violence and loss. It kind of just made them stronger. In 1934, after being allies for quite a while, they banded together to form the three affiliated tribes, and their alliance is now permanent and has been since. More on the three affiliated tribes. Today, the three affiliated tribes hold slightly less than 1 million acres of land on the Fort Berthold Reservation in northwestern North Dakota. And you can see down here in this map, it shows some of the different reservations and the sizes that they take up. In the darker reddish color, it's the size of the reservation. As a government, the three affiliated tribes offers a variety of services for the members of the tribes. Some of these services include healthcare, education, and economic programs. Our focus for this lecture is going to specifically be on the Mandan community, as I stated earlier. I just wanted to give the background on the three affiliated tribes because that is where they are today. So the Mandan have two origin stories. The first origin story of the Mandan says that the ancestral Mandans appeared out of the earth at the mouth of the Mississippi River. And when they came out of the earth, they brought with them corn, and their chief good-furred robe had the spiritual gift of corn medicine. His powers came from the bundles of sacred objects that he owned, and that would give him the right to teach others how to grow maize and to become successful farmers. As the group continued to grow, they had migrations, but each year they would pause to plant and harvest corn. And eventually the Mandan, through their migrations, reached an area of fine evergreen trees. And this is where they would learn to make bows, arrows, and snares, which allowed them to supply meat to go along with their maize for their meals. The lure of bison drew the Mandan westward, eventually leading them to the place where the Missouri River and the Heart River meet. They chose this location with the rich soil to plant their corn. The second origin story explains how the makeup of the landscape came about. So in this story, first creator creates Lone Man, and Lone Man, since the earth is nothing but water at this time, just wanders across the waves for a long time. Eventually, Lone Man comes upon a duck, and he asks this duck to dive down and bring up some soil for him, which he uses to create the land by scattering it across the area. Then Lone Man meets First Creator, and the two argue over who is older until First Creator eventually proves that he is older because he is Lone Man's father. He created Lone Man. After they've settled this argument, the two decide to better the land. Lone Man traveled north and east, forming the flat grasslands with lakes, timber, and lots of animals. And First Creator went south and west, creating jagged badlands, which held streams, hills, and bison. Then the two returned to the Heart River, and First Creator declared that it would be the heart, the center of the world. Then in this location, they formed men and women to fill up the land which they had just created. So farming, as you may have picked up in the last couple slides, is a pretty important part of the Mandan way of life. The Mandan grew many crops, corn being the most prominent, as seen in their first origin story. But beans, pumpkins, squash, sunflowers, and tobacco were also crops that they would grow. The Mandan didn't just produce enough for themselves, like their own family, but a surplus which they would use to trade with other tribes and eventually Europeans and Americans. The Mandan used rakes and digging sticks when working their fields. Some of the rakes were made out of deer antlers, and others were made using long willow shoots. When it was time to harvest their fields, the Mandan would use a hoe which they would make from the shoulder blade of bison and attach it to a long wooden stick as a handle. Along with farming goes their hunting. They supplemented their agricultural diet with bison meat. The Mandan and many other plains tribes would fish for bison. The bison would fall through the thin ice on the river and float downstream. And then the village tribes along the river would collect the bison and enjoy the well-aged meat. They also had fish as another source of protein. They would build fish traps and place rotted meat in them as bait to catch the fish, but bison seemed to be their primary meat source. All right, a look at what some traditional villages might have looked like on the Heart River confluence. Archaeologists have found as many as 21 settlements around the Missouri and Heart River confluence that were occupied between 1500 and 1750. 6 of these are now thought of as traditional Mandan towns or villages. The Mandan built a ceremonial plaza for each town, which was marked by a shrine that summoned the sacred lone man. Past the plaza, a typical village was filled with earth lodges, which could have been rectangular or round. The round lodges could have ranged from 20 to 60 feet in diameter, so these lodges were pretty large. A village may have had any number from 12 to more than 100 lodges, so these villages varied in size, but some of them could be very, very big. In these villages, there were drying stages positioned between the lodges, which tended to give the town sort of a cluttered, unorganized look, but they were hung 6 or more feet above the ground, so they weren't really an obstacle for foot traffic. They just made it look a little bit crowded. During the harvest season, these drying stages were filled with sliced squash and thousands of ears of corn. Family gardens would run for miles outside of the town along the river. The acreage being farmed, though, depended on the size of the population, the agricultural skills of the population, and whether they preferred farming over hunting. Trade on the Missouri River. The Mandan created a focal point of trade on the Missouri River. Tribes from all over the plains came to barter for agricultural products. The Mandan actually established the marketplace of the Central Plains, which later would be the forerunner of trading posts that would come to the area. While trade allowed the Mandan to obtain goods that they didn't have, it had negative impacts as well in the form of disease being brought with the goods that they were trading for. Another village, the name of one village we can talk about is Double Ditch. It is one that was once overflowing with life. It's located just north of today what is Bismarck. The name Double Ditch comes from the 2 trenches that can be seen in this picture. They served as protection for the Mandan living there. So you can see in this picture, there are also low mounds that assisted in defense for the villagers. Many of the smaller depressions, which can be seen today, were once cache pits used to store food. The villagers at Double Ditch followed the traditional Mandan way of life. They would hunt bison, fish in the river, and they grew different types of corn along with squash, beans, and sunflowers. They gathered large amounts of these foods and dried them for the winter or for trading with travelers for the intriguing items that these travelers brought with them. We can say that conflict must have been steady due to the defensive ditches surrounding the village, but even with the conflict, the Mandan were welcoming of outsiders who were interested in trading. Unfortunately, though, like many villages, smallpox made its way into Double Ditch, greatly affecting its population. So some population estimates in the 16th century of the Mandan, it's not possible to nail down the exact number of the population during this time period. Archaeologists have found at least 20 Heart River settlements that were occupied after 1500, but some of these may not have been true Mandan villages. They could have been Hidatsa or mixed Mandan-Hidatsa communities. Given the size of one of these settlements, Double Ditch, as we talked about earlier, it appears that the population must have been very large. There could have been any number of 10,000, 12,000, or even as many as 15 to 20,000 members of the Mandan community. But as I said earlier, it's not really possible to nail down the exact number from the time. There was a collapse in population in the late 1500s. There's something that caused a big decrease in the population at Double Ditch and the nearby Larson settlement. It seems possible that the loss of population could have been due to groups breaking off and moving from these villages to build new settlements and towns, but it's more likely that catastrophic events were the cause for this decrease in number because it was so steep. The population density of the Mandan was high, close to 100 people per acre. And so one possible reason for the collapse could be the inability to dispose of the waste created by the large number of their people, the inability to have access to clean water, that sort of thing. Environmental factors produce another possible explanation, specifically the effects of a massive drought in the late 1500s. We don't have information to know if the drought was severe enough to devastate Double Ditch and Larson on his own, but drought-related issues definitely could have caused problems for the Mandan. The people of Double Ditch and Larson could very easily have had enough food to feed themselves, but outsiders may not have, which would have caused these outsiders to attack the Mandan to get to their food stores because they were starving. Another effect of a drought is the pests that can come along with it, specifically grasshoppers, which can destroy the crops before they have a chance to grow, which would very greatly diminish the food supply. Another very, very possible cause for the decrease in numbers was the arrival of infectious diseases alongside the European trade goods around 1600. So the smallpox epidemics, there were several waves of the epidemics of smallpox that hit the Mandan and all the surrounding Great Plains tribes over the course of history. No one really was free of the effects of smallpox besides groups that were more nomadic and traveled and not stationary in one place. Towards the middle-ish end of the 1700s, maybe like 1780s, probably about, the Mandan villages were hit hard by smallpox. It is thought that they may have been hit harder because they often had outsiders visiting, as I mentioned earlier in one of the slides. Outsiders who were wanting to trade, the Mandan would just let them come in usually, and that could have introduced these diseases and smallpox specifically. They were forced to abandon the villages like Double Ditch and move up to the Missouri to settle in just 2 villages. Their numbers were so diminished that they just were worked down to just 2 villages. Once again, they were struck by smallpox in 1837, and this wave lasted many weeks, leaving less than 130 survivors. The Mandan had lost their strength and looked to form the alliance which allowed them to survive. These alliances still hold today, and there's a hint at the 3 affiliated tribes alliance. Some of the first visitors to encounter the Mandan included French trader Sieur de la Vérendrye in the fall of 1738. He described the Mandan as being in full power and prosperity, although the Mandan had not yet suffered the losses from disease and war when he had visited them, so they would have been strong in numbers at this point. Lewis and Clark in the fall of 1804, a fur trader from the Northwest Company named Alexander Henry in 1806, George Catlin, an artist who visited in 1833. He witnessed the Okipa ceremony and portrayed it in some paintings, which we will look at in a little bit. Maximilian, the Prince of Oude spent the winter months of 1833 to 1834 with the Mandan. And so the Okipa ceremony was a 4-day ceremony that centered on the painful initiation of the most promising young men and was considered to be the centerpiece of the Mandan religious calendar. It would start out with all these young men participating in a 4-day fast and completing feats of endurance, for example, being suspended in the air. All of this was strictly observed by a priest within their medicine lodge. The entire community would ask the Great Spirit for fertility and an abundant supply of buffalo by performing the bull dance while these young men were completing their fast and their feats of endurance inside the medicine lodge. Whoever was participating in the bull dance had to wear an entire buffalo skin, the head, horns, hooves, and tail. And this dance, which imitated the movements of buffalo, was repeated 40 times over the course of the ceremony. The final part of the Okipa involved the young men being brought from the medicine lodge. Sometimes they had to be dragged because they were so weak from their 4-day fast and their feats of endurance. They would either run or be dragged and go in a circle around the big canoe in the final race, the last race, a final test of their strength and courage. So here there's a picture by George Catlin of the interior medicine lodge. You can see all these men. Some of them kind of look like they're maybe feeling weak, feeling the effects of their 4-day fast. And you can kind of see some of the ropes that are suspended, which they would be suspended from for their feats of endurance. Here's a picture of the bull dance. You can see these members are donning their buffalo hides. You can see the herd, the horns, the tail, the hides, they've got it all on, and they're dancing, doing the bull dance. Then this last picture shows the last race where these young men are brought out of the medicine lodge. You can maybe see some of them maybe look like they're being dragged right here or laying on the ground. So obviously a 4-day fast while participating in endurance activities would take a toll on the body. So you can kind of see that in this picture. And we'll look closer at these pictures in our assignment for the class.